Welcome to the National Archives and Records Administration's 2025 Genealogy Series. My name is Erin Townsend, and I'm the coordinator of this year's program. We are so happy you've joined us. Every year, the National Archives hosts the Genealogy Series, a free educational genealogy event broadcast on YouTube. Our presenters are records experts from National Archives locations across the United States. The sessions offer family history research tools on federal records and are open to everyone, from beginners to experienced family historians. All are welcome. We invite you to join the conversation. During each session's premiere, you can participate with the presenters and other family historians via live chat. Ask questions and get the presenters' answers anytime throughout the video and for an additional 10 minutes after the presentation ends. Here's how to engage in the live chat. You can ask questions via chat by first logging into YouTube. Continue to watch chat because the speaker will answer the questions there. Type your questions at any time throughout the presentation. Please keep your questions on today's topic. We are offering 5 genealogy sessions in May and June, starting May 13th and ending June 17th. If you miss a premiere broadcast, please know that the videos and handouts remain available online after the event, where you can view them at your convenience. Welcome to today's presentation titled From the Territory of Montana to the Republic of Vietnam, Researching Native American Veterans in the National Archives, 1881 to 1966. We have 4 presenters joining us today: Cody White, Kayla Dawkins, Rose Buchanan, and Leo Belleville. Cody is an archivist at the National Archives at Denver and a subject matter expert for Native American related records. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and a Master of Library and Information Science from UCLA. He has been with the National Archives since 2012. Kayla is a reference archives specialist at the National Archives at St. Louis, where she has been employed for 9 years. She has a Bachelor of Arts in English Language and Literature from Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, as well as a Master of Library and Information Science from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Rose is a reference archivist at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and a subject matter expert for Native American related records. She has been with the National Archives since 2015. Leo began his career at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in 2012. Currently, he is an archivist at the National Archives at Chicago. He has a Master of Arts in History with a focus in Archival Museum Science from California State University, Northridge, and a Bachelor of Arts in History from California State University, Channel Islands. Welcome, Cody, Kayla, Rose, and Leo. Thank you for your presentation today.
Well, hello there. My name is Cody, and boy, do we have a talk for you today, jam-packed with records, photographs, documents, maps, letters, stories. Every one of our millions upon millions of archival boxes hold stories, and today we have pieced together just 4 to help show you how federal records can detail an individual Native American's military service and life. But as you'll see, many of these research avenues can help you research any veteran within the same eras. To help tell these stories, I've enlisted, see what I did there? Some of my great colleagues and friends to hop on throughout today's talk. And of course, I'm extra excited that Kayla is here to better explain the rich holdings in St. Louis. For as you'll see when talking about veterans' records, every road leads back to St. Louis. Thank you all for listening as we premiere this live today or in the future if you've come across this talk online. Kayla, it's all yours.
Thanks, Cody. Hello, everyone. I'm Kayla, and I'm happy to be joining all of you today, along with Cody and my other colleagues, to share and demonstrate the ways in which our records build upon each other to tell some dynamic human stories. Like the saying goes, the sum is often greater than the parts, and today we're going to share a truly great blend of records to make a Nara Sunday. Now, before I start to mix my metaphors too much before lunch, let's dig in.
We're focusing on Native American veterans today because the unique relationship between tribal nations and the federal government means our records can often chronicle an individual's life from birth to death, most notably within the records of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which, moving forward, since we in the government love acronyms, we'll just call it the BIA. That, along with the fact Native men, and as we'll see women, have served in the U.S. military since the beginning, even before our country was founded, and with this month of May being National Military Appreciation Month, it all just comes together. This collage here is of photographs the Blackfeet Indian Agency up in Montana collected. The BIA was big on highlighting Native contributions in World War II, so collected servicemen photographs for various publications and promotions. Today's stories will take you into collections across the country. It's gonna sound a bit like Hank Snow's "I've Been Everywhere" song. The records we'll highlight today come from the National Archives in Washington, D.C., College Park, Maryland, Chicago, Kansas City, Denver, St. Louis, and Riverside, California. If you download the slides from today, most images are linked to their applicable entry in our online catalog where the digital version lives, or we'll show the facility that holds the record series. I'd needed this slide to show you just how massive these collections are. From our Pennsylvania Avenue location there in DC, to Kayla's stomping grounds in St. Louis, to a shot I took in our archival bay here in Denver. This row of BIA records, note the different types too, boxes for documents, oversized ledgers, wide map boxes. The record types run the gamut. So when you make a request, just recall these pictures and imagine what goes into finding that one particular record you are looking for. Let us go back 144 years to the territory of Montana. In 1881, Neck Thowd, English name The Fork, enlisted for the first time as a U.S. Army Scout. So for context, in 1866, Congress passed a law allowing for uniformed Native Scouts, which is where today's talk begins. Specifically, the late 19th century Indian Wars, where men from a host of tribes enlisted as U.S. Army Scouts, the government exploiting the traditional rivalries between warring tribal nations. With Custer's last stand, only a short 5 years before, most of the fighting had tapered off in Montana, nothing like the Apache battles much further south, but the Army still maintained a heavy presence and skirmishes continued across the territory. Here we see an actual photograph of the Fork at age 64 and his wife Hitz from their 1925 industrial survey found at our Washington, D.C. facility. There was a BIA effort in the 1920s to chronicle every Native farmer across the country and what they were producing. So here we meet Old Man Fork. Now I say that because I was visiting with a friend a few months back who works for the Fort Belknap Reservation Police, and I'd mentioned this talk and he exclaimed, "Old Man Fork." So it's stuck in my mind. We start today with Fork, as the late 1800s is where our BIA records for individuals really pick up. In the absence of any compiled military service case files that we see for volunteers in, say, the Civil War, and for everyone in the 20th century, for regular Army soldiers in the 19th century, we have to turn to a host of sources to piece together the Fork's service. We start with the Register of Enlistments. These were microfilmed, 81 rolls total, covering the entire Army from roughly 1800 to World War I. Within these registers, created long after with compiled data by the Army, are two entire rolls just for the Indian Scouts. These microfilm rolls have been digitized and are found on all of the major genealogy websites, though often not indexed or indeed very well, given the cursive and the quality of the scan. They are a little wonky to search, so they're broken into date spans, and then the individuals are alphabetical within that. Given that each Scout's standard 6-month tenure was considered one enlistment, you'll often find multiple entries if they signed up multiple times. Here we see Fork's second enlistment under his native name, and basic biographical information is provided. His height, age, complexion, where he was from. You'll see here a little number annotated, 335. Now file that away for now, as we'll see when diving deeper how that leads one to his enlistment papers. And from that register on the last slide, we learn he enlisted at Fort Assiniboine up in Montana, which brings me to this diagram found in our cartographic records branch in College Park, created by the War Department in 1885, only 3 years removed from when the Fork was there. Very detailed layout, and right there, box 28 on the far right is the Scouts' quarters, where the Fork would have lived while on post. Knowing the post is important because with that, we can turn to another digitized collection, the post returns. They were required to be done every month and are organized by fort, then by date. So once you find the right place, you can just scroll along reading what happened over a span of time as these were done every month. While the post permanent staff is listed, all we get for the Scouts detachment is a line entry of how many were on post. In May of 1882, we learned there were 5. Also on these forms is the monthly history of activities that gives us an idea of what was happening. May of 1882 was when Fork left the Army. And as it were, what was happening at the fort that month? A whole lot of nothing, according to this. Some telegraph line construction seems to be it. Like the post returns we just talked about, each Army unit had to generate a return every month as well. Again, not indexed, but organized by unit and then date. The May 1882 Fort Assiniboine return noted there were 2 units at the fort that month, the 18th Infantry and 2nd Cavalry. The register enlistment does note the unit a soldier is attached to, but Forks only had the fort name, as some scouts were generically assigned as a Scouts detachment at a post. We'll see in his paperwork later, he was largely used by the 18th. So here is the May return for that unit. These list out every officer, but not the enlisted, unless they were coming, going, injured, disappeared, whatnot. In this case, Fork's discharge is not noted, but the form is still interesting in that, like the post return, it offers us a little history on the unit's activities that month. One company marched 150 miles scouting out the Sweetgrass Hills. Another was the one building that telegraph line, and yet another worked on a wagon road to Rocky Point. So all of these resources, while the originals are at our DC facility, have been scanned and you can browse them from the comfort of your own home. However, but wait, there's more. An entire record series about the Indian Scouts. So while you've all been hearing me talk for a while, I would now like to bring out a special archivist guest star to explain this collection that is not yet digitized. Allow me to turn the talk over to my very good friend and yours, fellow subject matter expert, Rose Buchanan. Rose, it is all yours.
Thank you, Cody. Yes, we have an entire series here at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. of enlistment papers for Indian Scouts. So the enlistment papers were the standard forms that were filled out when a scout signed up to serve. The forms have lines for the scout's name, the date they enlisted, the city and state where they enlisted, their term of service, their age at the time of enlistment, their physical description, including their eye color, hair color, general complexion, and height, and their signature or mark. So a lot of really useful information. And we have a comparable series of enlistment papers for other soldiers who enlisted in the regular Army. And you can actually see here with one of Fork's enlistment papers that his form was modified from a standard form used for other soldiers. So whenever the word soldier appears in the form, it's replaced with scout. And instead of indicating Fork's birthplace, the form indicates his tribal affiliation. That's pretty common among the Indian Scout enlistment papers. The forms were often modified to suit the scout's unique situation. The Indian Scout enlistment papers are arranged alphabetically by the first letter of a scout's surname, and then numerically by their enlistment number. So Fork's papers shown on the screen are filed under F for Fork and 335 for his enlistment number. And you'll recall that the number 335 appeared in Fork's entry in the Register of Enlistments. So checking the registers is one way to get a scout's enlistment number. But we also have a separate index to the Indian Scout enlistment papers that you can check for the enlistment number. The index is arranged by the geographical area where the scout served, either Arizona, Indian Territory, New Mexico, or the Northern Plains, and then alphabetically. And as Cody mentioned, scouts could and often did sign up for multiple enlistments, and that's usually indicated in the index. So checking the index can save you some time in tracking down the enlistment papers if a scout served more than once. And while the enlistment papers themselves are not digitized, we do have a digital copy of the index available if you email our DC branch. So now I will turn things back over to Cody.
Thank you again, Rose, for your time, and most importantly, for always answering my endless questions about the great records you have there. Side note, if you're ever in DC, drop in. Maybe do some research, hold history in your hands, stop off to see the Charters of Freedom, visit the wonderful building. I would say tell them Cody sent you, but I'm afraid that won't get you very far. All right, so back to Montana, because now the Fork has left the Army, but he doesn't leave government service. He settles on the Fort Belknap Reservation just south of the Canadian border, seen here on this 1935 map, and that is where the rest of his story will take place. Turning to the records of the Fort Belknap Indian Agency held here in Denver, we find records of his employment by the reservation agency. Native employment in the BIA was very common, not only as laborers, but as policemen, farmers, teachers. Everything in that era, every decision had to be sent to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs office for approval, especially in hiring. So here we see in 1893 the hiring of Fork as a laborer for $240 a year. And then in 1907, when he moved up into the agency police force at the same salary. In agency records, you can also often find employee applications, resumes, leave forms, evaluations. However, the Indian police, for some reason, were exempt from eval, so there are none in Fork's case. For a while, reservation agencies would also keep detailed registers of their employees. So with these, we can track Fork's employment year by year. The organization of these volumes varies by reservation agency. Some split out the whites and natives, some split out the offices such as school or agency. The police and judges, all of whom were always native, often had their own sections. So I've quickly shown you how employment records were kept at the reservation agency itself. But overall, personnel records were often consolidated and today can be found in St. Louis. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome for the first time today of many, Miss Kayla Dawkins.
Thanks so much, Cody, and hello again, everyone. I'd like to begin my time with you today by introducing you to the records of federal civilian employees, or official personnel folders. We call them OPFs for short. OPFs are open to the public if the employee is separated from federal service prior to 1952. After that, members of the public may make requests for these records under the Freedom of Information Act. I'll talk a little bit more about that process later in this program. For now, let's keep our focus on the Fork's civilian service. The card you see on this slide is called a service record card. Service record cards serve as a summary of an individual's employment with a specific federal agency. They vary in detail from agency to agency. Some even have photographs. But in general, they contain personally identifying information like date and place of birth, date of service with the agency, position titles, private in the case of the Fork, location of satellite office, Fort Belknap for the Fork, and salary. The Fork was paid $20 a month, which translated into today's money is a little over $400. Instead of the full official personnel folder, the Fork only has a service record card to represent his time spent working for the BIA. Some federal employees have both an official personnel folder and card. Some have a folder and some only have a card. This practice is variable and depends on the record-keeping practices of the agency at the time of employment.
The employment record ends in 1917, when the Fork resigns to become a farmer. We learn this reason from the notes section of the employee register and from the changes in staff forms sent into the commissioner, seen here. This coincides with the allotment process on the Fort Belknap Reservation, when each tribal member was granted a parcel or parcels of land to encourage farming. The land allotments weren't as formal as the homesteading, desert land, forest land entry processes. There wasn't a case file per se like all those, and by and large, tract books, seen here, large land registers, are where they were noted. The fork was granted 420 acres across 3 parcels. His one 320-acre piece was just a few miles north of Hayes, Montana, and today Highway 66 tracks right along the east edge of the section. So here we see, via Google Maps, looking west at where the fork used to farm and graze cattle.
Now, at the same time the allotment law was passed, another law was passed that directly affected the fork. For each conflict in the 19th century, a special law was passed granting military service pensions. So there was one for the War of 1812 vets, Civil War vets, and as Cody said, what was considered the Indian Wars went on for so long, several laws were passed for veterans of various eras. In March 1917, a law was passed granting pensions for those soldiers serving in Indian War campaigns from 1859 to 1891, which would include the fork. As we saw on the enlistment records Rose discussed, he served in an area of active Native hostilities for 30 days or more. This brings us back to the collections here in St. Louis. The Veterans Bureau, later called the Veterans Administration, created this card index to keep track of their applicants and supporting documents for veterans or their beneficiaries who sought benefits that they were entitled to based on their military service. Veterans Administration claim files, or pension files, are arranged numerically by the pension claim number. That's the number behind the letter C on the top right corner of the card. This index card series can be found on the catalog, at the National Archives ID number listed on this slide, and on Family Search. Indian War pension records are kept at 2 locations, the National Archives at Washington, D.C., and the National Archives at St. Louis. D.C. has the portion of pension records that cover the pre-World War I time period. The St. Louis portion of the pension files consists of veterans of World War I, as well as veterans of the Civil War, Spanish-American War, and other pre-World War I service who are still alive or whose beneficiaries were still alive and receiving benefits post-conflict. This series contains claims cases that were closed between 1917 to around 1955. However, only a percentage of pension files within this range can be found in St. Louis because not all claims were closed at the time of transfer from the VA to the National Archives. I ran into this exact issue when I tried to find the Forks pension file to share with you all today. While his claim number is within range for our collection in St. Louis, his record was not included in the transfer. This is likely because his claim file was still considered active at the time of transfer. For situations like this, you can make a Freedom of Information request with the Veterans Administration to gain access to the record. While it's frustrating to hit this kind of snag in your research process, it reinforces the significant impact of these records. In this case, they were still in use 80 years after the end of the Fort service.
So 2 years before that 1925 photograph of the fork had been taken, farther south, our next veteran was born, John Werito. He was born a few miles east of the Star Lake Trading Post in New Mexico, in, as he described in his own words, an old adobe house, little better than the log cabin in which Lincoln was born. The Navajo Nation is huge, massive, 27,000 square miles across parts of New Mexico, Utah, and Arizona, larger than 10 U.S. states. And it is largely rural, so for much of history, activities and settlement centered around the scattered trading posts. The Star Lake Trading Post was on the far eastern side of the reservation. Here is a close-up from a 1937 map from our holding showing it. The Werito family lived just a few miles east. Now, that adobe house line, I didn't make that up. That comes from John's own hand. For when he attended the Ute Vocational School here in southern Colorado, later called the Southern Ute Boarding School, he wrote out an autobiography where we learn much about his early and at times tragic life. Werito's family at the time of his birth consisted of his parents, a brother, and a half-brother from a previous marriage of his mother. High mortality rates leading to shifting families was common at the time, and it only became worse for the family, with the loss of his 2 infant sisters born later. The spring of 37 brought further tragedy when his mother fell ill and passed away. Werito wrote, "This was a hard blow to me because I adored my mother." Werito started his education at the Crown Point boarding school, but after his father remarried, he left for Ignacio, entering the Ute Vocational School, for which we have his student case file. Here are some examples of the records you find in student case files for that era. The record of pupil, which was essentially a grade transcript, Werito earned solid Bs. Then we have these school census cards. They're more about attendance. Here we see his years at Crown Point listed, and then the days he attended while at Ute Vocational. These are especially useful for when earlier student case files no longer exist. One can track where a student had been. Some more record examples. These locally used records at the school. Many BIA schools often have their own homegrown or purchased forms. So here we glean some more anecdotes. He was in the art club. The Talking Leaves must have been a school newspaper. He was part of that. And basketball every year. The Red Raiders were the team. He mentions that in his autobiography as well. As evident by the name, the school's big focus was on technical training, careers and trades for the native students. Werito was trained in automobile, truck, and tractor repair, and this standard U.S. Office of Education card was issued to prove his aptitude in various repair tasks upon his graduation. And that was on April 29th, 1943, when Werito graduated along with 8 others. But his future plans were already decided, as 3 days earlier he had enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, which means we head back to St. Louis and Kayla.
Thanks, Cody. John's official military personnel file, which we'll call an OMPF going forward, details his 2 periods of enlistment with the Marine Corps, from 1943 to 1945, and again from 1947 to 1952. The OMPFs here in St. Louis are the primary administrative records that contain information about the veteran's service history. They include enlistment information, which is where you're going to find some true genealogy gems. You'll also find the veteran's employment history prior to service and unique skills and qualifications. OMPFs have information about duty stations and assignments, information about awards and decorations, disciplinary actions, and other personnel actions. Sometimes you'll find handwritten correspondence and, depending on the time period, and if you're lucky, a great photograph like the one we have here of John. While serving with the Marine Corps, John was able to apply his skills and trades learned through his BIA school experience, like his aptitude in automotive repair and his studies in agriculture. However, the skill that led to his defining mission was his native language. He served as a Navajo code talker. In fact, you can see that the Marine Corps listed code talker as his principal duty here in his service record booklet. Also, the cover of the service record booklet provides the distinction of his identity as a Navajo Indian. While John's trade skills provided a strong foundation for his duties, his heritage and knowledge of the Navajo language were assets that contributed to his distinguished and courageous service as a Marine. This courageous service, believe it or not, can be tracked in part by the slips of paper you see here. These are called embarkation slips, and they can be found in the service record booklet of Navy and Marine Corps OMPFs from this time period. They were issued each time an individual embarked on a mission, and they included information like ships' names, unit information, dates of battles, captures, pretty much any logistics involving arrival and disembarkation. John's slips give an account of his instrumental participation in major battles in the Pacific. They include a record of his engagement in the capture of Saipan in June of 1944, and note that he was wounded as a result of that action and had to be evacuated. They also placed him at the Battle of Iwo Jima in 1945, a single logistical note with a profound historical impact. Embarkation slips can also include merited awards and citations earned. John's include his Presidential Unit Citation Ribbon Bar and Blue Enamel Star for participation in the Mariana Islands operation, but John's awards only stack up from there. All told, John's battle honors include 2 Purple Heart medals, a Bronze Star medal, and a handful of campaign and unit level awards, like the presidential unit citations I mentioned for his actions in Saipan. OMPFs contain additional award and citation information, like the memos you see here, which include more specific accounts of the actions taken that earned the veteran the award. Sometimes the descriptions read like documentary films with a precise retelling of the details, and others can be a bit more cinematic.
And sorry to barge in on Kayla's portion, but I wanted to note here that the BIA student case files often had things from after their school years. And in this case, John had become friends with the principal, Robin Dean. So much so, he was listed as a point of contact on some forums. Here, Dean saved a souvenir photo postcard from Tijuana, as well as a Christmas card. His discharge form and certificate were also filed with the school.
I can excuse the interruption, Cody, because it speaks directly to my last example from John's OMPF. Often, handwritten letters and OMPFs include administrative things like the soldier providing a change in home address. However, John's note gives us some insight into his post-war plans for his continuing education. No wonder he became pals with Principal Dean. In it, he mentions his desire to participate in a summer class on silversmithing. However, he was concerned that this might interfere with some of his military training. When we find letters like this in OMPFs, they can offer some additional depth and understanding of the person beyond their military history. It also helps us to know where we might pull in connections to additional record series. John was called up again for service in Korea. At this point in time, he was working as a jeweler. Maybe he got to take that silversmithing class after all. He was discharged after 2 years and went on to continue his work for the federal government as a post office employee. He retired from his work at the post office in Denver and was later buried there in the Fort Logan National Cemetery.
At the same time John was coming of age in New Mexico, Viola Eastman and her family were tossed around the country, as so many others, during the turmoil of the Great Depression, as we'll see. Our next veteran, Viola Eastman, was born in Michigan in 1919 on the Isabella Indian Reservation, where her mother was enrolled. Her father, part of the great Sioux Nation of the Dakotas. Here we see them on the 1920 federal decennial census, Father Francis, Mother Estella, or Stella as she'd go by, and two of the later three sisters, Josephine and Viola. These censuses, the latest released being the 1950, are priceless for creating a rough framework of where anyone was living over the decades, and are a good starting point for genealogy research. While living in Michigan, the girls were sent to the Mount Pleasant Indian School, and if you recall from the last section, sometimes schools did records different from others in what they saved and how they organized the files, and Mount Pleasant is a great example of that. So I could either try to explain that secondhand, or I can have my good friend Leo Belleville, who has worked in these records for years, do so. Easy choice. So please welcome yet another archivist guest star to the talk, Leo Belleville. Leo, please take it away.
Thank you, Cody. The Mount Pleasant Indian School opened as a non-reservation boarding school in 1892 and eventually it closed in 1934. The school began to perform agency duties for the Indians in the state of Michigan at the time. Located north of Lansing and Saginaw, Michigan, the school opened with 23 employees and 177 students on more than 360 acres of land. The Eastman family file is part of the more than 1,600 family records we hold here in Chicago. The clerks at the BIA uniquely arranged the files by family, with brothers and sisters in the same student file. In some instances, we hold an individual folder for all members of a family, and there may be a separate folder for a different family member. There are instances of a married woman of the community who had her individual records moved with their maiden name into a new family folder with their married name. In addition to the individual school files, we hold 50 cubic feet of administrative, educational, correspondence, and financial records. It's the most visited records we have on the floor here at the National Archives in Chicago. But we're here to talk about one woman, Viola Eastman, one of the first Native American women to become a United States Marine, who was a student at the Mount Pleasant Indian School. Viola's father, Francis Eastman, and her mother, Estelle Bradley, both graduated from the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. They married and settled in Ortonville, Michigan, near the Mount Pleasant School, but not close to the Mount Pleasant School. The children were originally denied entry to the Indian School as there was a local public school closer to the home. Estella wrote and asked that the children be allowed entry to Mount Pleasant because the roads in the winter were not passable. Viola and her siblings were only at the Mount Pleasant School for a short period of time, from the summer of 1929 to early 1933. Viola attended classes with both her two older sisters, Dorothy and Josephine, along with her younger brother, Francis. In 1929, the school had a girls' and boys' dormitories. There were classrooms and a dining hall. Viola would have also visited the hospital and the dentist on school grounds. The school raised animals, grew vegetables for the meals provided to the students in the local community. Young boys would have attended classes on farming, equipment maintenance, and learned logging skills. The girls were taught home economic courses and could be hired out to the local homes as for after-hour jobs. Traditional academics were taught on Monday through Saturday class schedule, with Sundays set aside for church and additional chores. The school had both the school band and a choir, and movies were shown. Most likely due to the economics of the time and the reported debt on the family's property in Michigan, Francis Sr. moved the family to Sisseton, South Dakota, and eventually enrolled the children at the Pipestone School. The Eastman family saga in Michigan ends with correspondence between the superintendents of the Mount Pleasant and the Pipestone School, which states that the 4 children were enrolled in Pipestone and were, along with 4 other boys, doing very good work this year, and we are pleased to have such fine boys and girls in our school. While at Mount Pleasant, Viola's advisor noted that she was a very desirable student, and yet the principal reported she was above average, but makes no attempt to do her best and makes little use of her abilities. After examining the rest of Viola's life, we can assume that the principal's remarks were unfounded. Examining the records can show the links between the individuals from thousands of miles away and the steps they took along their journey.
Thank you so much for joining us, Leo. So as Leo's file pointed out, there was concern Francis was going to lose the family's 40 acres to delinquent taxes. So they packed up and headed west to the Lake Traverse Reservation, where Francis was originally from. Incidentally, within a year, the Mount Pleasant School would be closed, so they would have had to find a new school regardless. Francis and Stella applied, and the children then enrolled in Pipestone Indian School in southwestern Minnesota, which is only 30 miles due west of where I grew up on our family farm. These student case files are today found at the National Archives at Kansas City. So record-wise, we now go from Chicago deep dish pizza to Kansas City barbecue. An example of the vagaries between case files from various BIA schools, the Mount Pleasant School didn't save any forms with student grades, but often copies of student files moved with a student in the BIA school system. Here are 2 certificates of promotion found in her Pipestone School file, which notes the grades earned during a school year, one of which is from Mount Pleasant. In the 10th grade, Eastman transferred schools yet again, this time to the Haskell Institute in Kansas. And yet again, there is a student case file in Kansas City for her tenure there, which brings us to 3 student case files in total across NARA for her. Viola Eastman graduated from Haskell on June 8th, 1941. Now, going back to her Pipestone School student case file, as with Werito, there are records present from after her tenure, such as this 1943 letter to the school superintendent asking for a recommendation to join the U.S. Marines. She writes in part, "The uniforms look so nice." From the letter, it appears she is working in DC prior to becoming one of the first Native women Marines. So with that hint, let us go back over to Kayla.
Yes, Cody, another perfect example of a letter that provides clues leading to additional record series. When you see mention of individual military or civilian federal service, you think St. Louis. Viola's federal civilian service began in 1941 with the Department of Agriculture. Specifically, she worked for the Agriculture Adjustment Administration in Washington, D.C. as a clerk and stenographer. Like the fork, as opposed to a full official personnel folder, or OPF, this service record card is the only record that covers her early civilian service. Sometimes these cards can serve as guideposts to help track civilian employment when the employee continues on in civil service past the point in which the full OPF would be open to the public. While Viola's full OPF isn't yet open to the public, we can use this service record card to give us a peek into her work as a civilian employee. Viola worked with the Department of Agriculture until 1943, when she then enlisted in the Marine Corps, where she finally got to wear that nice-looking uniform. Viola transitioned from civilian service to military service in August of 1943. Her first stop was for training in North Carolina at Camp Lejeune. This training gave her the chance to get out from behind the typewriter at her clerk's desk and instead behind the wheel of a truck in a motor transportation course. Truck driver would become her principal role in the Marine Corps Reserve. Now, before we look at more of Viola's ONPF, I'd like to take a minute to share a few stellar examples of some of the photographs that can be found at NARA's Still Picture Branch in College Park, Maryland. But the good news is you don't even have to be in Maryland to look at them. They're on the catalog, along with thousands of other images. Here we see Viola with Celia Mix and Minnie Spotted Wolf, some of the first Native women to enlist in the Marines. The Marine Corps was so jazzed about their enlistment that they set up this publicity shoot while the ladies were at boot camp at Camp Lejeune. Plus, Viola got to model that sharp uniform she'd previously admired. So if you're searching for a photo, but you run out of luck in an OMPF, you should go have a look at the photographs from our Still Picture Branch on the catalog. They're constantly uploading new images, and you never know what you'll find. Now, let's jump back into Viola's Marine Corps ONPF. Viola spent time on lots of different air bases all over California, made the rank of sergeant, and got married during her time in the Marine Corps Reserves. The qualification card seen here is another example of a seemingly boring standard military form that can actually reveal some genealogy-related gold. Not only does it contain information about prior education and employment, it also contains additional specialized capabilities like proficiency in writing and speaking other languages. There's even a section entitled, quote, talent for furnishing public entertainment, end quote. Here we discover one of Viola's talents. Turns out she could play the saxophone. More important to this presentation, though, is the fact that this qualification card is where I first discovered her civilian service with the Department of Agriculture. Records leading the way to more records. Viola separated from the Marine Corps Reserve in November of 1945 and went on to continue to work with the federal government for many years. So many years, in fact, that her official personnel folder is not yet a public record. Since Viola's civilian service extends past the point of her record being open to the public, as did John's service with the post office, this seems like a good opportunity to provide a quick aside about how you can request access to these OPFs. Unlike official military personnel files, there is not a rolling date on which these records become open to the public. OPFs for former federal civilian employees who separated after 1951 remain in the legal custody of the Office of Personnel Management. Access to these records is restricted under the Privacy Act of 1974, and only limited types of information from these records is releasable to non-authorized users under the Freedom of Information Act. A request of this type will need to be referred to the folks across the Mississippi River in Valmeyer, Illinois, at the National Personnel Records Center Civilian Records Annex. A couple of things to note about these kinds of civilian records requests. 1, if the subject of your request is deceased, be sure to include proof of death in your request. something like an obituary or a copy of the death certificate. 2, they will need your handwritten signature or digital signature with your request. The contact information for Valmeyer is up on this slide for your reference, but you're always welcome to reach out to me directly. I'd be happy to connect you with my colleagues at Valmeyer to guide you through this request process for these records.
Spring 1944. John Werito was fighting for his life on Kwajalein. Viola Eastman was driving trucks at the Marine Corps L Station El Toro outside Irvine, California. And on February 14th, our next veteran, Tony Dedman, was born. Here we see Fred and Zonnie Dedman's family living on the Navajo Nation in the special 1950 Census Indian schedule, fully scanned and available online. Dedman attended Nazalini Day School until the 2nd grade, when he entered the Phoenix Indian School. Now we jump over to the National Archives at Riverside, where the Phoenix Indian School student case files are held. Dedman attended for 4 years until his parents, wishing to have all 3 other school-aged boys in the same school, applied to have them transfer to the Intermountain Indian School in Utah. Let's talk about student photographs for a second. Photographs and student case files start to appear in the late 1930s, usually then just one upon entry. But by the 1950s, they were often compiling every annual photograph. Those of Tony from the Phoenix Indian School years seen here. So some background about the Intermountain Indian School. It opened in 1950, converted from an old Army hospital, and it was the first BIA boarding school to be opened in a long time because of the Special Navajo Education Program that started in 1946, a 5-year crash course in reading, writing, arithmetic, and a trade for the tens of thousands of Navajo kids that had never been in school, giving them a chance in the rapidly changing United States following World War II. The program largely worked, and the need eventually phased out, but the idea of teaching trades as a focus at Intermountain continued on, as we'll see with Dedman. The school photograph of young Tony continues in his Intermountain school file, and we watch as he grows into a young man. As we mentioned, Dedman took a full complement of core classes, but also had a trade focus as well, in this case, welding. And like with Werito at Ute Vocational, there are evaluations of his trade work and documentation on the skills he obtained. As we see on this slide, his counselor concluded on his education, he is a sincere and conscientious workman. He is loyal and tries to do his best at all times. Dedman finished school in 1964 and was issued a certificate of completion. So the BIA schools loved finding out where students ended up so they could brag about success stories. They had been doing this as far back as the Carlisle school days in the late 19th century. They couldn't find Tony, so wrote his parents. The parents sent the form back, annotated, and the form is now in his student case file. Tony Dedman had been killed in action. Now, some of you who are familiar with the National Archives privacy rules probably had guessed something like this was coming already, given I was out here sharing photographs and records from a 1960s student case file. For the rest of you, BIA student case files are generally closed for 75 years after the date of the last record or until the death of the student. And even then, mentions of other students are redacted, but in this case, Tony's file is straightforward. But how did he end up in Vietnam?
The draft, Cody, the draft brought him to Vietnam. Well, kinda. We can see the full story by decoding his Selective Service System classification ledger page. Tony received his first letter in 1963, at which time he was still enrolled in school, and so he was able to get a deferment. That's the 2S classification you see here in the first column. He received his next letter in 1964 and at that time received a 1A classification. This indicated his availability for military service. Tony went ahead and voluntarily enlisted in 1965. This is indicated by the classification 10C E&L. The next line indicates his death the following year.
We get his casualty database entry from the National Archives Access to Archival Databases website, which, let me tell you folks, is loaded with great born digital databases. His entry seen here is found in the series Records on Military Personnel Who Died, Were Missing in Action, or Prisoners of War as a Result of the Vietnam War. His entry is interesting. They list him as Caucasian when he was most definitely 100% Navajo. He entered the service in LaGrange, Illinois, ostensibly where he had been working or living. It is also here where we get his service dates. Here we see a photograph of the 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry, 173rd Airborne Brigade. This photograph was taken in September 1966. This is actually Dedman's sister battalion, but I chose it because it shows exactly what he would have looked like and done. I checked with our still pictures branch, and even with their rich Vietnam War photograph collection, where this shot comes from, it's organized by topics and units, and so many are in color as seen here. I could only find photographs of the 173rd dating May of 1965, when they first arrived in country, and before Tony's July arrival, and then over a year later in September 1966, and none for Dedman's battalion. Using the caption info, this photo was taken about 90 kilometers north of Nui Dat in South Vietnam. Why is that interesting? Thanks to a history of Operation Hardihood, which was primarily an Australian operation, we know exactly what happened to Tony Dedman. I quote, "At 3:30 p.m. on May 17th, B Company of the 1st to the 503rd was moving up the western slope of Hill 72, 1.5 miles north of Nui Dat. They knew that they were being followed by a Viet Cong rifleman carrying a radio, but they did not know that in their path was a Viet Cong company who were being guided by the man with the radio. The Americans were caught in deadly crossfire of a box ambush to which were quickly added 60-millimeter mortar bombs. By the time they had extricated themselves, they had lost 8 killed and 23 wounded," end quote. Tony Dedman was one of those killed. He was 22 years old.
Through what was no doubt a harrowing and arduous effort, records were generated to account for these lost lives and the disposition of their remains. 2 such record series for the Vietnam War era are the Individual Deceased Personnel Files, or IDPFs, and the Tan Son Nhut Mortuary Records. IDPFs consist of materials related to the deaths of individuals who are military and civilian federal employees. They include active duty personnel stationed overseas, those serving stateside, and veterans who died in military hospitals after leaving service. The documents found in these records may include lists of deceased individuals, certificates of death, autopsy reports, description of the cause of death, list of personal effects, medical records, and information regarding funeral arrangements and payment of benefits to the next of kin. Mortuary files tend to have less detail, and they primarily contain information about the time the body spent at the mortuary, from intake, identification, treatment and preservation, to disposition and internment. Though the information found in these records can be morose, heavy, and painfully detailed, I'd like to provide some examples of some key forms to look for. The casualty report from the IDPF can provide detailed casualty information. For example, Tony's casualty report specifies that he died of a gunshot wound to the right thigh received in hostile ground action. It also includes contact information for next of kin and other beneficiary designations. The statement of recognition from the mortuary file is generated when a member of a soldier's unit is called upon to help the mortuary technician officially identify remains, a harrowing experience that would put soldiers face to face with their fallen friends. A soldier by the name of Samuel Moore identified Tony's body. Under the section called "I recognize the remains because of the following," he was able to identify Tony by his facial features. Other means of identification could have included scars, birthmarks, or even tattoos. A list of personal effects can be found in both the IDPF and mortuary file. These lists can be a particular point of interest because they can tell a story about what the soldier felt was important enough to haul along with him in and out of conflict. We can see that beyond the basic necessities for a soldier, Tony's personal effects included a doll, a banjo, and a camera. These effects are returned to the listed next of kin upon the death of the soldier. Tony's official military personnel file is also here in St. Louis. OMPFs become open to the public 62 years after separation from service or death of the veteran. Since Tony was killed in action in 1966, his OMPF will not be open to the public until 2028. In the meantime, a request for his OMPF can be made via the Freedom of Information Act.
58,395. That's how many names are carved into the reflective black marble of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall, or were as of 2025, according to the National Park Service. You stand in the middle where the first casualties from 1959 began, and you walk about 25 feet to the right, panel 7E, and then scan down to line 69, Tony Dedman. Rest easy, Sky Soldier.
And with that, our time with you today has drawn to a close. We really appreciate you spending some time with us today. It's a privilege and a pleasure to share these records and the stories they hold with all of you. These stories are always made richer through the generous collaboration of my colleagues here at the National Archives. I feel particularly grateful to have collaborated with Rose, Leo, and of course, Cody. I'll leave the final words of farewell to him.
Yes, thank you for listening today. Thank you, Kayla, Rose, Leo, all the people that helped with the records today across the country. Randy in Riverside, Elizabeth in Kansas City, Aaron in College Park, Rachel and Martin also in College Park. Our great host, Aaron, John, Jamie, thank you all, and see you all on down the road.
Thank you again for watching. This ends the lecture portion of the broadcast, but we will continue to take your questions about today's topic in the chat. If we do not get to your question, please send us an email at inquire@nara.gov. Videos and handouts from the program will remain available on this YouTube page and our website. We plan future programs based on your feedback. Would you please take a minute to complete our short online evaluation form? At this time, I'd like to thank the Genealogy Series team who contributed to the success of this program. We are grateful for your work. If you enjoyed this video, check out our Know Your Records program. We have over 100 educational videos on how to conduct research at the National Archives. Although this concludes the video portion of the broadcast, we will continue to take your questions in the chat for another 10 minutes. Please stay if you have questions. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation.